Damon Hewitt here, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the Law. I am glad that we're here together today. I wish the circumstances were different in this moment, in this season, and in this work. Yesterday, we began Black History Month by burying Tyre Nichols, whose life was taken away by police for no reason. What a profoundly sad way to start a month of celebration. We know that Tyre Nichols deserved better, Black America deserves better, and all of America deserves better. But this moment is a reminder. I'm reminded about the life of Tyre Nichols before he cried out for his mother. Just as George Floyd did, he was a son, he was a man, he was a skateboarder, he was an artist, and by all accounts, he lived life fully. He captured stunning images as a photographer. On his own personal photography website is emblazoned the quote, "A good photographer must live or love life more than photography itself." That's reported to be the quote that he used on his social media as well. And love life, he did. It was apparent from what we've learned about him in his life after his death. The second, Tyre being taken away from his family, is obviously a reminder of all that we've lost and continue to lose every time state violence has its way with our communities. It's a reminder of why our work to advance racial justice is so important and how hard that work really is. If ever we needed another reason to fight, let this be it. Finally, as we think about Black History Month, it's important that we go past a reveling of accomplishments, which are important, celebration of pioneers, which is important, or even analysis of present circumstances, which is also important. We have to go beyond that because the true work of what they call the long civil rights movement has always been about building, not just analyzing and picking things apart. It's about building for a better tomorrow, for children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, friends, family, and people you don't even know and will never meet. It's not just about history, but about building what we call a just Black future. Because we know if we don't succeed in building that future, then Black history is all we're going to have left. And we can't live like that. I'm honored today to have an amazing set of panelists, call them all friends and colleagues in one way, one form or another. I'll introduce them briefly and then we'll get into our discussion. We will have ample time for discussion with you, the audience, using the Q&A feature in the Zoom. First, we have Lola Velazquez-Aguilu. She is Chief Legal Counsel for Neuromodulation at the medical technology company Medtronic. She's an alum of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota, handpicked by Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison to build the medical case that was key in helping to convict Officer Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd. Lola is also a Lawyers Committee board member. Welcome, Lola.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Professor Chavis. She's the R. Hugh and Nully Haynes Professor of Law and Director of the William and Mary Center for Criminal Justice Policy Reform. She has substantial experience and writes and teaches in areas related to criminal law, criminal procedure, and justice reform. She is a former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, where she was involved in a wide range of prosecutions and arguing and briefing appeals before the D.C. Court of Appeals. Cami is also a friend and another Lawyers Committee board member. Welcome, Cami.
Thank you.
Next is Jonathan Smith. He's Executive Director of the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs, the DC affiliate of the National Lawyers Committee. He served as chief of the Special Litigation Section in the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2010 to 2015, reputed to be and known to be some of the most productive years and impactful years of that unit. That section, of course, is responsible for pattern and practice investigations, or pattern or practice investigations, to get the term technically right, that we've been calling for over the years. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Damon. It's good to see you.
Likewise. And last but not least, Arthur Ego serves as Director of the Criminal Justice Project here at the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Before coming to the Lawyers Committee, Arthur spent nearly 2 decades at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, representing children and adults facing serious delinquency and felony charges, ultimately serving as the trial chief at PDS. Arthur is doing right now pioneering work with his team on addressing the unchecked power and influence of police unions, who so often stifle even the most modest and certainly meaningful reforms. Thanks, Arthur, for being with us today.
Thanks, Damon.
Great. Well, let's get into the discussion with this group. I'll pitch questions to some of you, as you know. Others can feel free to respond if you're so moved to as well. But let me start with Cammie and Lola in that order. Break down what you saw in the video to the extent you were able to consume those really difficult to watch images. What did you see in terms of the actions or inactions of the officers involved, and what did you see or not see that concerns you the most beyond that obviously being the final moments of Tyre Nichols being lucid and alive?
Thank you. And, I think the important part of this conversation, you said, did we have a chance to consume the video? A lot of people have chosen not to watch this video because it is so difficult to watch, and it is very repetitive of what we have seen for many, many decades in this country with unarmed Black men being brutalized by police officers. But I did watch the video. I think it is important to bear witness to what is still happening out there in our communities. And what initially, when I watched the video, I saw, okay, first of all, these officers are wearing body cameras. And after watching the entire video, you can see that the body cameras were not particularly helpful in terms of figuring out exactly what happened. It was actually that sky camera that was so important to give us the picture. But I noticed that the initial stop, when they stopped him, they grabbed him and pulled him out of the car without saying why they pulled him over. So from there, everything goes downhill. So I'm wondering, when I'm seeing this, why are you stopping this person? Why are you grabbing them and physically pulling them out of the vehicle? And there's no attempt at de-escalating. And then there were all of these, once they are restraining him, all of this stop resisting. And what you can clearly see is that he does not appear to be resisting at all. And that was very reminiscent to me of many police reports that I've read and there was always an assault on a police officer. And so I think we need to begin to question those types of charges. But again, that common refrain of stop resisting, he didn't appear to be resisting. And then you don't have to watch this video, but if anyone tells you that this man was restrained and is kicked in the head, that at that point, before that point, but that is absolutely outside the scope of any proper use of force. So, and when I saw that, I just, immediately, I agree with the charges that have been brought.
Thank you. Lola.
The word that kept coming to mind was chaos. From start to finish, what I saw in this video was violent chaos on the part of the officers. It was chaotic, both in terms of their physical actions, but then you add on to that the way that they did not mirror their actions with their words. So extremely confusing for Mr. Nichols in that moment, not just because he's not getting the kind of notice that one would expect in a routine traffic stop. Did you know what happened? Did you realize you drove through that red light? Could you roll down your window? Immediately, he was met with this violent chaos. And that, what I thought was interesting is when you're talking about whether, pattern or practice investigations, I know we'll talk about that in a little bit, but the officers at the initial stop I don't know that they made it to the scene of the assault. And yet what we see is the same. There's violent chaos where the commands are not making sense. They're not coming out in a sequential order. They're not consistent with their training. And then we see the same thing at the second location. Violent chaos where the words don't match the physical actions from the start. And so it seems almost to talk about escalation here is a little bit, it feels a little strange because it's always at the highest level from the very beginning. what we see is Mr. Nichols trying to de-escalate the situation. And I'll disclosure, as Damon knows, I really struggled with whether or not to watch the videos. But then I had a long conversation with my mom, who is a retired police officer, and she had watched, and she always watches. And she said, I would really encourage you to watch, Lola, because we have to bear witness and you can't look away. So I woke up this morning and I watched the videos this morning, and I disclosed to the panelists, I feel a little raw still from having watched that video. What struck me with Mr. Nichols was not just how calm he was, which I think when we talk about kind of what might happen in the medical case, if this proceeds to trial, I think is super relevant. Not just how calm he was, and not just the way that I think he tries to demonstrate his humanity in the beginning. There's a moment where he says, stop. And he said it in a way where it was like, it was reasonable and it was calm and it was in the midst of all of this chaos. But what I felt from him was, can you imagine, right, the internal conflict where you know that you've got to comply with whatever it is that they're expecting you to do, somehow reading their minds in this instance. But compliance could mean your death. You know, there's a moment where I felt like if you're him on the ground, if you know anything about what happened to George Floyd, I would absolutely be thinking, I'm not going to lay on my stomach. I'm not going to lay in the prone position on this cement, because we know what happens in those circumstances. So my heart broke for him, thinking about how do you protect yourself from the police?
Thank you so much, Lola, for sharing that. You know, if it's not raw, you're not human, right? You know, I saw Tyre Nichols as the adult on the scene.
Yeah.
The calmest person there, who's among all the commands that you mentioned, he's ordered to lay down on the ground. He said, I am. No, lay down a different way. You know, like in anyone's, these are officers, this is their professional work, right? In your professional life, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a teacher, an educator, when you're trying to get to a result, if your technique is so poor and ineffective, and then you result to essentially throwing a fit, and in this case, people throwing a fit had a monopoly on the authorized use of force, it can just lead to disastrous results.
There's one other thing I don't want to miss. I remember at the end of the first video, we hear one of the officers say, I hope they stomp his ass. And he says it multiple times. And so it just goes to show that what happened, what was always going to happen.
Right.
From the beginning.
That's right. Jonathan?
Yeah, I didn't watch the video. I have tremendous respect for everybody that did. And in some ways, I watch a lot of videos, so I don't need to. I believe what happened. I don't need the video to believe what happened. And not that anybody on this call does, but I also, you know, when we think about the video, I have very complex views about them, because the normalization of this kind of violence is on us as a culture is horrible. Well, bearing witness is also essential, and I don't, you know, that's a compromise that is sort of hard sometimes to figure out how to balance. But I don't know, having read a lot about the video and talked to people on this call and others, I think there's some other things that we know almost immediately from this video beyond what happened in those moments in which that murder took place. We learned an awful lot about the culture of that police department. We now know a lot about the Memphis Police Department just from that incident. It's the fact that it was a command and control over him, that it was a very old school, police officers used to be trained that you ask somebody, you tell somebody, then you make them do what you want to do, right? This was exactly what was happening here. It was an ask, tell, make kind of approach to it. You learned a lot about the culture by the failure of officers to intervene. You learned a lot about the culture by the fact that they got together to confer on their stories afterwards, that there was a collaboration. They knew how to cover themselves up. The other thing I think was important to highlight about this is this was a crime suppression specialized unit those are very dangerous units. They are sent out almost with a sort of a lawless agenda, and across the country you see these crimes, however they're sometimes called, gun recovery units. You saw in New York in the Floyd litigation. We have gun recovery units here in the District of Columbia that do similar stuff. The Baltimore, the scandal around the Baltimore unit. These specialized units themselves are fundamentally sort of extremely concerning, and that was played out here. And I think that the other thing, just to highlight, and I agree with everything else that's been said, and I don't want to repeat it, but the highlight here was the role of the emergency medical staff and the failure of the emergency medical staff to step in. And this reminded me, I had the honor to do an investigation of the death of Elijah McClain in Aurora, Colorado, for the city, and what we saw there, and officers have now been, or members of the emergency medical team have been charged there for failing to have intervened when the officers were brutalizing Elijah McClain. And in fact, not only did they fail to intervene, they took the officers' instructions to administer a dose of ketamine that was for a person almost twice the size that Mr. McClain was, which contributed to his death. And the parallels that we see, I mean, this incident and the incident in Aurora are the shocking parallels about how the incident started, the brutality escalating throughout the incident. When you talk about, if you listen to the video in McClain, you hear him pleading for his life, while at the same time the officers in this very clinical way figuring out what other pain technique they can apply to him. And then the use and the failure of medical staff to step in and say, stop, I'm going to provide treatment, I'm going to provide care, I have a duty of responsibility to this person. All those parallels, and that plays itself out. These things all, particularly with these crime suppression users, play themselves out over and over again across the country. Not everybody dies, and so we don't always hear about it, but it happens far more frequently than you'd think.
Damon, if I may just add one thing, because I think what Jonathan said about what we know about the culture of the police department, after watching this video, another thought that I had was these officers knew that they had their body-worn cameras on, and they knew that multiple officers were around, and they presumably knew that the city had these sky cams, these police cams as well. So what that shows me is that, all right, they believe that, okay, I can do this, and really no concern that they would be disciplined, really no concern that any other officer would come in and say, hey man, stop. None of that. So that tells us a lot about the lack of supervision, the lack of a fear of accountability.
Mhm.
They really had no fear or thought of accountability. And I know we'll talk more about this, but
Right.
there are broader concerns in Memphis than just this one case.
And it tells you that these officers were not bad apples. That this is what the whole lot is normalized to do. It's not the first time they've done this. I don't know that for a fact, but one can only infer based upon the zeal with which they did what they did, knowing that they were captured by at least some body cam, even if they didn't know about the sky cam, which ironically was probably there to capture evidence of crime in the community. Well, it sure did capture
Yeah,
that.
I mean, again, I hope
Yeah.
they stomp his ass. I mean, you cannot get away from that quote. He
can't.
has an
You can't.
expectation for
You
what's
can't.
coming.
Yeah, like cheerleading it. Arthur, let me turn to you. So we have an interesting panel. The team you lead is all former public defenders as far as the attorneys on that team. And now you're here amidst others who have been enforcers, prosecutors who have vindicated rights, right? In the federal system at DOJ and at U.S. attorneys' offices throughout the country. I'm curious, Arthur, what do you make as a lifelong defender of our people of the fact that the charges were brought so quickly and the nature of those charges against these officers?
Thanks, Damon. And so in direct answer to your question, it's not hard when you have this type of video to bring these charges quickly. Depending on a prosecutor's office, this is a major metropolitan area in the United States, right? Memphis is a major city in the United States. They're going to have resources to convene a grand jury instantaneously, to show the videos to the grand jury, to have people testify as to what they believe to be proper use of force, You can do that. You can effectively do that in one day. And at the end of the day, have the grand jury vote on charges, present the charges to the grand jury and have the grand jury vote on charges. So it is not hard. What is to do that? What is surprising is that this is one of the few cases where this was done this quickly. Not just a complaint filed, but a grand jury indictment filed. I do want to, though, lay out the difference between what is happening in this case and what happens to people who are poor, Black and brown, and who are also charged with crimes. And the substantial difference here that I've seen is the lead charges are second-degree murder, and then they're also related kidnapping charges. Kidnapping, if I'm not mistaken, is a predicate felony for felony murder in Tennessee. It is remarkable that they did not bring first-degree felony murder charges. If you were talking about a non-police officer in this situation and they were charged with kidnapping and a related homicide, I would be very surprised if you were talking about a poor Black or brown person who was not also charged with felony murder. Now, as a public defender, as a former public defender, I have a lot of feelings about felony murder, and I think that it's overcharged. That, frankly, that it really should not exist as a separate charge. But what I'm trying to do is highlight the difference between what was sought here against these former police officers and what's frequently usually sought, I should say, against non-police officers. And I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but it's fundamentally different. And what complicates this also too, that I do want to acknowledge, is that the prosecutor in Memphis, the DA in Memphis, is a campaign as a reform prosecutor. So this very well could be this prosecutor's practice now is not to bring felony murder charges, but that is something that was remarkable to me in this case. And at some point, I don't want to dwell on the video, because I agree with John. I watched the video and I watched it a few times. Before I watched it, I believed it already, right? I believed what was said before I watched it. But what's remarkable is that there are two terms that people are talking about where we as a nation thought we had gone beyond, right? Which is contempt of cop and testifying. Contempt of cop, for those who don't know, is basically a police officer's excuse to charge you with something like resisting arrest or assault on a police officer. And you see that in this case where these police officers are holding Tyre's hands and saying, "Give me your hands," and stop resisting. They're using the body-worn camera and the video as a tool for prosecution in an unspoken way. They know what they're doing. They're holding his hands and they're saying, "Stop resisting, give me your hands," setting up a potential charge for resisting arrest. They are saying, "Lie down," when he's already lying down on the ground, setting up a potential charge for resisting arrest. And then what you also see is in the police report, because it took 3 days for Mr. Nichols, for Tyre to die, that what they were saying was that Tyre was complaining of a shortness of breath. And so so we thought we were beyond this whole sort of notion of contempt of cop and testifying, and this 100% shows that in the body-worn camera video, they set up the evidence for they use the body-worn camera as a tool for prosecution, in that what they were doing in an unspoken way were saying things like, "He must be high. I mean, he was going for my gun," none of which was supported by the video, but they knew how chaotic, Lola hit it right on the head, how chaotic that video was. He was going on for my gun, and knowing that was unclear in the video. I mean, it's clear to me, he's not going for these cops' gun. And then there's one remarkable moment too in the video where one of the police officers clearly covers up his body-worn camera, because you can hear all the volume, but then the visual goes blank. We've seen that a lot when police officers do is they will do it in a way that is exceedingly sneaky. They'll walk up to each other and stand chest to chest so you can't see anything, and knowing that they are being recorded. it has become second nature to manipulate the body worn camera videos. These officers were doing it. And I apologize for going on for so long, but I do want to say one last thing that I don't want to end my discussion of the video this way. I watched the video multiple times. It was very difficult. And then I watched a video posted by the Mirror Institute of Tyre skateboarding. And he was serene in that video.
Thank you, Arthur. I'm going to jump. It's hard to jump to a mundane topic now. So I'm going to dig into one that's even that's just as triggering, if people have a lot of thoughts about, which is the fact that, as everybody sees, the officers who appear to have been involved in the fatal blows, although not everyone on the scene, were Black officers, Black men. The officers who have been charged so far, I haven't read the headlines this morning to see if there's more, are all Black men. And some people see that and they're freaking out. And some people are saying, I told you so. And in the ultra conservative media, I saw all these headlines about, because I do op research a little bit too, all these headlines about, well, how could they claim this as racism? How could Civil Rights Division say they're looking at a civil rights investigation? I think those of us who are in the cause and movement of justice have a neat understanding, but just what's Cammie, your best articulation of what the dynamic is and why people shouldn't be so surprised?
This in many ways, it's an incredibly nuanced discussion, and in many ways it's not. Everyone knows that Black officers are just as prone to violence as white officers, particularly when it comes to policing Black people. There are a lot of things, Black and brown people. And so the first thing I would say is that it does not matter whether these officers are Black or white. When we know the activity that took place and the violence that took place, they have to be held individually accountable. And we'll talk about all the organizational concerns as well. But at the same time, it's really interesting because, and I was listening to Ben Crump at Tyre Nichols' funeral yesterday, and he said, well, now we know that it is possible. So for all of these people who, like Arthur just said, these things can be done. You can convene a grand jury in a day or two. It doesn't take years for this to happen. So I am a person who questioned, I thought, okay, these officers have to be held individually responsible. And of course, again, structural racism, with the question we have to ask ourselves is, would these 5 officers, first of all, they would never have been chasing down a white individual, possibly, or a female, right, in the same way.
Right.
These very aggressive police tactics of the Scorpion unit. These tactics are, and Jonathan talked a bit about this, these tactics are reserved for vulnerable minority communities. And until we are honest with the fact that, and we can say that, oh, well, these are the same communities that are experiencing, community violence, but that does not mean that everyone in that community immediately becomes a suspect, and that's what's happened. So that's part of it. But I also think that as we think about this now, these police officers have shifted to being Black defendants, and they are going to get the Black defendant treatment. If again, I've heard them called gang members. I've heard them called animals, thugs, and we can think about whether that's appropriate, and we can agree with some of those terms, even perhaps. But the rhetoric that we're hearing around these officers, it is not the same rhetoric that we're hearing when white officers are involved in cases that are just as egregious. I have heard more people reference the Rodney King beating from 1991, I believe it was 1991, and similar, but 54 baton strikes and I mean, or multiple baton strikes and 55 officers from multiple jurisdictions hanging around. It's the same thing. But those officers, let's not forget, those 4 officers who were directly involved in that beating were acquitted in a state court.
That's right. That's right.
So we have to have an intellectually honest discussion about the fact that I hope that this will be a blueprint. I hope that when this happens to anyone, that the officers involved will be immediately held accountable and that the organizational culture will be of the police department will be examined, because again, we can talk about, holding them criminally responsible as well as I'm really more concerned too about preventing the next one from happening. We can talk about the adjudication that is going to happen with these folks after a tragedy, but how do we prevent the next tragedy? And part of that is realizing that these aggressive police tactics, they are okay to be used in minority, Black and brown, vulnerable communities. And that is not how it should be.
That's right. It's not a white on Black problem, it's a blue on Black and brown problem that we're seeing. I'm going to keep moving, but if at any point a panelist wants to chime in on the issue, feel free to interject. And also, there are some questions coming in the Q&A feed. Feel free, panelists, to write answers out back to those people. We can also take up many of those questions during the formal Q&A segment in a few minutes. Let me go back to you, Lola. So you're well known, of course, for leading the building of the medical case to get Chauvin convicted in Minnesota. Do you see medical evidence being potentially key to what will likely be prosecutions of these indicted officers in this case?
I don't think it should be, but I think the use of force case will be so challenging for them that they may see a medical case as as a strong option for trying to get an acquittal. So it'll be interesting. We don't have the autopsy report yet. I think it's interesting and notable that they charged without potentially having yet had the final autopsy. They may have likely have had enough even preliminary information about cause of death that they knew the defense wouldn't be able to do much with that. I also think there's a very interesting conversation around the role that medical examiners have played in these death cases involving use of force as a result of, to some extent, I mean, it was happening before Dr. Fowler testified in the Chauvin prosecution, thanks to the leadership of individuals like Dr. Roger Mitchell from Washington, D.C. is now at Howard University. There are some within the medical examiner community who have started to look more closely and been champions on issues of bias and the way that bias has influenced deaths in custody and the lack of prosecution in those cases. So, we'll see what happens with the autopsy here, but I think we saw, to Arthur's point earlier, the officers trying to start a narrative, and the consequence of that narrative was it arguably also further delayed medical care. So if you contrast Mr. Nichols' words and demeanor and frankly his state of being at the beginning of the encounter, he's very clear-headed. His words are in no way slurred. There's no indication that he is in any way under the influence of any substance whatsoever. As you said before, he is the adult in the room. By the time, and he's also young, and he's thin, he's fit, he's able to run right from that one distance to the other. But by the end of the encounter, when he is seated, when they've got him propped up against the car, he cannot speak. There's a moment where he tries to speak, he cannot speak. His words are slurred. He can barely lift his head off of his chest. And the officers are saying, oh, he's definitely on something. He had to be on something. He's definitely on something. That's going to be a difficult narrative for the defense if they try to proceed to trial, because the video from the moments prior will
Right.
undermine those efforts.
It's causation, cause and effect,
Yes, absolutely. I think as well, there's an interesting awakening, of course, that I think is happening, and I hope is happening in the medical examiner community. I think it's also happening in the medical community, the reality of finding a physician who's going to testify that the blows to the head and to the body did not cause the death here could be quite hard. But that's where we'll have to understand more about what specifically caused Mr. Nichols' death.
Thank you. Jonathan, let me turn to you. We know that the Department of Justice, led by my predecessor, our friend Kristen Clark at the Civil Rights Division, has already initiated an investigation into this killing. But what more can the Department of Justice do? Is this action limited just to this incident, the Scorpion unit itself, which is now disbanded? What's kind of the spectrum of options to give people a sense of what's possible?
Sure. So there are really three buckets of things that the United States Department of Justice can do. The first, they've already initiated. There's a Civil War era statute, 28 U.C. 242, which makes it unlawful for anyone under the color of law to willfully deprive somebody of their civil rights. And that's the single crime that can be charged under these circumstances. And they've opened an investigation. They've announced an investigation of a willful violation of Mr. Nichols' civil rights. The department also has authority under a statute that was enacted in the wake of the acquittals in the Los Angeles of the beating of Rodney King, which gives the Department of Justice, and this is the Civil Rights Division in my old section, the Special Litigation section, the authority to investigate patterns and practices of the violation of the Constitution and federal law by law enforcement. And those are the pattern and practice cases you see across the country, in Baltimore and in Cleveland, in Newark and New Orleans, et cetera, and those investigations can go in and they can provide, conduct an investigation of the department. And what we've seen from this video alone is enough to be concerned about the sort of a department-wide set of issues. And I have to say, in every case that I've been involved in, which is now, I've probably been involved in some 30 police departments around the country, at the core of every one of these, one of the issues uniformly is a lack of accountability. It's not the only problem that exists in the department, but it is critical. And that was demonstrated in this case here. And that the problem of a lack of accountability goes throughout the entire department. It's never confined to just one unit, one supervisor, one squad, one activity. And so I think there's reasonable basis for the department now to choose. There's 18,000 police departments across the country. There's lots of police departments, lots of problems. Memphis is not the only one, but we're the department to go in. This is what we saw from this incident alone is sufficient basis for there to reasonable cause to believe there's a pattern that's worthy of investigation. That investigation would be undertaken to result in a report that would document what the department found factually, what the department concluded with violations of law. It would ultimately lead to a consent decree. And I would love to, you haven't asked it at some point, I'd love to talk a little bit about what consent decrees can and cannot do, which is important. The third thing is that every jurisdiction receives a lot of federal funding. A lot of federal funding is contingent on the compliance with the federal civil rights laws. The department has the ability to withdraw that funding where there is violations of laws. They never do it. Never do it.
Never do it. I was almost late to this webinar because we were in a meeting with congressional leaders about that. And we know that the President's State of the Union address, folks, is coming up on Tuesday. And we in the civil rights community have sent a very crystal clear message about what we expect to hear and what we don't want to hear. What we expect to hear is, what will the vast array of federal authority have to do now, given what we've seen in terms of failed legislation, which I think we'll talk about in a sec, and other executive action. And a lot of it has to do with the gravy train of money that goes out to local law enforcement. But I don't want to jump on you all's lines. Cammie, let me turn to you, because you've written you're doing some scholarship over the years about the limitations of the pattern and practice investigations, the resulting consent decrees, the role of community. So I ask you to talk about some of the limitations, and then Jonathan, you can chime in again about some of those as well. Cami, sorry.
Yes. So a couple of things. I also wanted to respond to the funding question, because there's the carrot and the stick. There's the stick of, we're going to take this money away from you if you don't comply. And that certain, again, that has not been the practice of the department. And maybe now it's time we try that. But I am also a fan of the carrot in terms of, let's give money to police departments who can actually create programs and show and demonstrate that that they can reduce these types of occurrences, and that they can become models for other departments. So I am a huge fan of the federal pattern and practice legislation, the authority, and I actually think that and Jonathan can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the chief in this case could also invite, rather than wait for DOJ to come in and have this, federal presence in Memphis, Tennessee. If I were Chief Davis, I would invite the department to come in, take a look, what's gone on, what's gone wrong with this, not only with this Scorpion unit, but perhaps with the entire police department. There's so much that we learn from these investigations and technical assistance that can be given afterwards. I would want to know particular things like, how are these officers, because we're talking about a Scorpion unit, but again, that's one unit in one police department. These similar units exist everywhere, and there's a lot that we can learn. And maybe we'll learn that they're pretty ineffective, and pretty dangerous, or if we're going to have them, maybe we can put some guardrails into how they are formed. But how are these officers selected? How are they trained? What is the criteria for these officers making a stop? If you're out there, you're supposed to be reducing violent crime, but how is this reckless driving traffic stop a part of that? How does that fall under? Why don't you call someone else to do that? Or better yet, let's take armed officers out of traffic stops. Period. That's a whole other conversation. But how many complaints has this unit received? We also know that several of these 5 officers, several of them had previous complaints. They don't have the 18 complaints that we saw in the Derek Chauvin case, but that's because a lot of these officers hadn't even been on the force that long. And so how were they made to be part of this specialized unit? So those are all of the things that I think that Chief Davis could be asking herself, and others could be, other chiefs around the country should be asking. And why don't we have DOJ invited in to come in and take a look? But there are limitations to this, because as Jonathan said, we can't, DOJ is, but there are only a certain number of attorneys within that special litigation unit, but there are 18,000 police departments. So our local governments have to be a part of this reform. And we saw in the wake of George Floyd how quickly and nimbly some of these police departments and cities moved forward with banning chokeholds, implementing the duty to intervene, which I hope we can talk a little bit more about some of the nuances of that and the protections that need to be in place in order for that to be effective. But there are a lot of things that our local governments can do, and can do more quickly than a federal investigation. Quite frankly, we know what's wrong and what's broken in many of our police departments, and we don't need a lengthy investigation. We have all of these previous reports that can tell us what practices are prone to causing these violations of the Constitution, what practices are prone to causing these deaths and the lack of accountability, and we can begin to fix them.
Thank you. Jonathan. Limitations.
So thank you, Cami. I agree with everything Cami said. It was very helpful framing. So one thing to think about, and the pattern and practice authority of the Department of Justice is to address violations of the Constitution and federal law. anyone who spends a lot of time reading the jurisprudence coming out of the United States Supreme Court about what the Fourth Amendment, use of force jurisprudence is, knows that that's a very limited jurisdiction in many ways. And in compounding that, the special litigation section is a small unit. I had 15 lawyers doing police cases when I was there for the entire country. Inside what is the largest law enforcement and police and jailing agency in the world. And so, it's got this, it's sort of this, there's a significant tension, but what the Department of Justice does is incredibly important. It's just not everything. And it's often, I think we often lose sight of when the Department of Justice gets involved, both the importance of what it does, but also the limitations of what it does. So the pattern of practice investigation will come in and look at sort of all of the practices and procedures and require the department to engage in policies and practices that comply with the Constitution. That may not be everything that a community wants. And if a community invests in the pattern of practice investigation, the belief that it's going to create a better police department that meets community values and needs, that's not going to be possible within the rubric of what the courts have described as the constitutional boundaries. Both have to happen. Both are incredibly important. And you think about, places like Seattle. Seattle's, I always think of as a good example, because we investigated Seattle. We found problems in Seattle. We had a consent decree. It went on for 5 or 6 years. It's largely done. So there's a little bit of a tail. People hate the Seattle Police Department, but use of force in Seattle is 50% what it was the day we issued our findings. So something really important happened, but it wasn't everything. And the political project has to continue. And the consent decree can support the political project by creating a larger amount of transparency. It can pour data out into the community. You can have access to the monitor and what have you. 2 other things really sort of quickly. One, to Cammie's point, about 10 states now have pattern and practice authority. I'm working with the Illinois Attorney General on a pattern of practice investigation in the Joliet Police Department. I've been assisting the state in their negotiations with the Minneapolis Police Department to get a consent decree in Minneapolis. So state attorneys general can play a very significant role. Maryland is seeking pattern of practice authority. Virginia has it. The final thing is this question of that Cammie really touched on, and I think is always worth a conversation, is this question of what is public safety and who defines it?
Yes.
And there's a fundamental problem with thinking about the Scorpion Unit as something that creates public safety. We know a lot about what creates public safety. And what the Scorpion Unit does to defeat public safety is really 2 things. One is it's going at the wrong problem, which is demonizing people of color and not doing those things that we know create public safety by building up communities, investing in communities and the things that make them safe and give people opportunity and engaging communities. It also means that the police officers themselves are a hazard to public safety. And even if you thought law enforcement created public safety through enforcement mechanisms, you shouldn't force communities to choose between having public safety and having somebody beat up their son. And so it's, that I think when we talk about sort of the whole policing project, we can't divorce it from actually talking about what we know is what works that builds community so public safety happens in a really meaningful way, and that those things can't be entirely disaggregated. DOJs can do a lot of important things in that space, but DOJ is not equipped to do all those things in that space. That's a political project that has to happen through organizing.
Right. I mean, the fundamental piece is organizers that we've worked with, that I've spoken to. I know, Arthur, you talk to a lot of these folks now. The fundamental thing is policing is not central to our concept of what it means to be safe.
Right. So
anything that is tinkering at the margins is tough. It also makes the carrot that you mentioned, Cammie, a bitter pill to swallow for a lot of folks, because the carrot often turns rotten. And with the dynamic where, Johnson, you mentioned that DOJ doesn't withdraw the money. I hope there's a renewed openness to doing so. It will come at a high political cost, a lot of political capital to do it even one time. But there's such a parallel in the education context. After Brown v. Board of Education, we know schools do not automatically desegregate. We know after the Civil Rights Act of '64, which tied federal funding to compliance, they didn't. It took more litigation and more threats and more enforcement by DOJ and Department of Education to some extent to actually start to turn the tide. And we're still in de facto segregation now, so it may not be a victory lap of course, but the parallel of what it takes to move when you have 14,000 educational agencies in this country, 18,000 law enforcement agencies, the scale and hyperlocal nature is very similar. We are running short on time. I want to turn to Arthur. We talk a lot about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act in popular discourse. It feels like forever ago that the bill was sabotaged in Congress, and I call it sabotage because we believe it was. Can you just remind everyone what are like the key facets of that proposed legislation that people are now talking about resurfacing, even though the political realities are grim on the Hill?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Damon. So some of the key aspects of the Justice and Policing Act include the creation of a national police misconduct database. So bad cops that have reports of being bad cops, those reports would be part of that database, and those cops cannot jump from police force to police force around the country and maintain their employment. The creation of certain use of force standards and the requirement that deadly force be used as the last possible resort, which seems logical. It seems, crazy that you would have to legislate that, but the reality is that you do, and unfortunately we haven't yet. There's a fair amount in there on limiting the ability for police departments to access military grade and military equipment from the Department of the Defense, with the idea being that you don't militarize the police departments around the country, that they are not the military, they're not occupying forces. And so those are some of the there's lots of other provisions I can keep going on and on about it. But the idea being is to make the police departments around the country more about service and less about control and militarization.
Got it.
And that to professionalize them so that you are eliminating bad cops. To Jonathan's and Cammie's points about overhauling what we see in police departments. It is a limited set of provisions that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, if it ever passes, is going to achieve.
Right.
And so the police right now, in terms of the narrative and in terms of crime, are centered in our national discourse, and they should be marginalized, right? That when we're talking about public safety, what we have to talk about are services, civilian services for people that need those, all the way from services for people that are suffering from substance use disorder, mental health issues, poor schools. Why are there not grocery stores across the river from where we're sitting here in Washington, D.C.? All of those things contribute to the problem of public safety, the problems related to public safety that many cities are experiencing in this country. And the police should be marginalized in that discussion. Right now, they have become the center of that discussion, and they have maintained that center status through their narrative. So the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act goes a fair distance in terms of making sure that there is accountability and transparency with regards to police forces around the country. But it's the beginning of the conversation. Right. That is one thing that I would really like to stress for everybody who's listening, is that there's a lot of talk about passing that. Let's say that there is a moment in Congress in the next few weeks where the legislatures in both the House and the Senate come to their senses and pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and President Biden signs it. That is the beginning of the conversation of changing policing in this country, and not the end. And I just want to stress one last thing, which was when George Floyd was killed on May 25th, 2020. Throughout that summer, you saw a national conversation, and what you saw in 2021 was more Black people in this country being killed by the police than at any time in the history of this nation. So this, and we seem to have forgotten those conversations about 2020, And they need, and that change and those conversations need to keep going.
Yeah. What does transformation look like? One more question before we go to the Q&A, because we are running short on time. I want to go back to Lola on this one. So, Lola, I don't know your full involvement in the prosecutions beyond Chauvin, but the other officers who faced state and federal charges, they were, I don't want to put a label on them. Some people call them bystanders. Some people said they were just, actively complicit, what have you. But what does the successful prosecution conviction of those officers mean when we look at a situation like Memphis in terms of what legal standards should be in state courts or at the federal level for officers who are not themselves the ones using physical force, but are part and parcel of what some people call a gang, the whole thing?
So it's interesting. Some of them, I mean, I think the only one you could possibly characterize as a bystander was Officer Tao, who described himself in his statement as the traffic cop.
In Minnesota, in Minneapolis,
In Minnesota,
right?
yes. The others were all physically restraining and compressing Mr. Floyd while he was restrained on the ground. But I'm sure, but the public perception, because they weren't Chauvin, was that they weren't bystanders. And that somehow that alleviates their responsibility. And I do think it taps at sort of do we not have an expectation that officers should be upstanders? I'll tell you, even in talking about that with my mom at the time and about the rookie, and again, for those who might have caught it, my mother is a retired police officer and she struggled with him, but I said to her, would you have expected me to stand up at a minimum? And she said, 100%. If you're one of those other officers and you don't know what's going on, at a minimum, you can stand up. And, the reality is that approaching it legally, there is a legal framework in place for these officers. It's aiding and abetting, that gets used by prosecutors all of the time. I mean, what has to happen is that people have to be able to see criminal conduct in a dispassionate way and apply the facts and the elements. And I think we've seen juries do that. They did it in the federal case involving the other 3 officers who went to trial in the federal court and were convicted, such that they came back down to the state court and they pled guilty. So I don't think that we need a different framework for them, but I think this notion of who's a bystander and what relevance does that play is something that we have to confront head on.
Thank you. Cammie?
Yeah, I was going to say, so yeah, the framework is there. There's the legal framework. And then even as a lot of institutions, jurisdictions have done in the recently have implemented the duty to intervene policies. But I want to be, we absolutely need these. We should have these. We have some precedent now because of the case and the officers involving Mr. Floyd. But the practicalities on the ground, these officers, and in my work, particularly around Black officers, is we say we want to have a diverse police department, and maybe these officers can come in and see what's wrong, or they won't act the same way. Well, as we learn through this discussion, they are still going to be influenced and impacted by the organization that they're in. And a lot of times Black officers, women officers are disciplined more heavily. They're retaliated against if they speak up. And so this doesn't mean that we shouldn't expect them to do it. It does explain why sometimes you don't see this happening. And there are things that we can do to put in place to ameliorate those factors. We need to understand what's happening practically on the ground and setting up things. You would think that having body-worn cameras there would help that, but we see that it hasn't.
Right. But we're going to turn to audience questions. We have a number in the queue. I'm going to go and ask for just some rapid fire, succinct responses here. One is from L. Humphrey. The question is dismantling qualified immunity doable? It is a judge-made doctrine. It's not a codified law, at least at the federal level. is it doable to dismantle qualified immunity, to eliminate or abrogate? Anyone care to comment?
I'll jump in here. So I think the answer is yes. The question is what replaces it. Qualified immunity was created to ensure that officers were not held accountable for things they didn't reasonably know were against the law, and then it's gotten way out of control. And I think that that's the Supreme Court and Congress, I think, have struggled with what to do. I think there is a recognition that it has to go for what comes to place it. The only thing I would say is that the conversation of qualified immunity, I think, is far too limited. We need to also look at Monell. It's its evil twin. Monell says you can't hold municipalities liable. Qualified immunity says you can't hold individuals liable. I want to get at those municipalities. So I want to get rid of Monell as well.
Make it everybody's problem to achieve justice. There's a question about from Samantha Sanchez regarding not looking away or the duties one has to intervene. Is it appropriate, she has, for individuals, I guess, civilians as bystanders, to begin witnessing police interactions as third-party witnesses? I'm thinking cop watch and recording officers, I think is what she's getting at. Or is there some danger? I don't know, we don't need a recitation of rights and responsibilities, but what have you all seen in your experience of everyday people who are fed up trying to at least document, if not intervene?
I've seen a lot more. I've seen a lot more of that happening. That people are fed up and documenting by filming. There have been jurisdictions. I can't, and I apologize right now. It's slipping. It's either Texas or Florida. It's always Texas or Florida. But one of them has tried to ban the public filming of police officers, and within a certain space. And so you're seeing the sort of retrenchment and opposition to that. But I think it is, it is something that has been helpful to the extent that it's exposing the, what the police departments are doing around the country. Police officers are doing around the country.
Arthur, let me stick with you. At the top of the segment I introduced, you mentioned your work and your team's work on addressing police unions. We actually had some unions on board with the George Floyd bill before other more regressive unions allied with regressive forces to help tank it. There's a question from Susan Smith about what's been a response of the Memphis Police Association. How has it been different? What has it been and how has it been different with respect to the fact that the officers in the Nichols case who killed Tyre Nichols are Black?
I've only seen one response, and I've looked for, I've looked for quite a few days. I've only seen one response, which was the public. This was, I'm paraphrasing, but I think I'm using the accurate terms. The public needs to, has the right to know what happened in terms of Mr. Nichols' death and everything that contributed to it, which is really sort of a nefarious way of saying, was he high and was he resisting? Right? This whole question of everything that contributed to it. That differs from a lot of other jurisdictions. It's hard to compare like one union to another union because you have a very different perspectives from the different union leaders. Like, Lynch up in New York, the NYPD union leader is very, very aggressive. And I'm not quite sure how Memphis compares to him, but this was a very different statement than from other unions where you have aggressive union leaders saying, either at least my officers were acting appropriately, or they deserve, their due process. We saw that up in Minneapolis with George Floyd, and so this was a very sort of tepid response.
I'm glad you asked the question, Damon, because I was hoping we would get time with Arthur to talk about what could be done with police unions and why that's an important part of the conversation. I did find, Arthur, I think, an expanded part of their statement, because I looked this up this morning, where they said, we have faith in the criminal justice system. That faith is what we will lean on in the coming days, weeks, and months to ensure the totality of circumstances is revealed. So yeah, the point, I thought that was interesting, right? Their faith in the justice system. And the totality, it's hints like they're winking a nod. There's more here. Don't jump to conclusions just yet.
The cop who wrote that must be a lawyer. So.
Or the lawyer for the police union helped.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting though, that again, in this case, and maybe it's the racial dynamics, we don't hear the strong coming out of these officers did nothing wrong and everything. I mean, which we have heard, and again, cases that are just as egregious. One thing though I wanted to mention when we're thinking about unions and collective bargaining, and Arthur knows way more about this than I do, but my sense is that the laws, there are differences in Tennessee that actually allowed the Chief Davis to fire these officers so quickly, and that even though we all want this to be a blueprint for what happens, there are other jurisdictions where that may not be possible because of the collective bargaining agreements that are in place. And so that again just calls into question how we again, the impediments that police unions and these bargaining agreements have for accountability and police reform.
Thank you so much. We may have time for one more and then some closing remarks. There's so many great questions to choose from here. I'm rarely at a loss for words when I'm having trouble choosing. So there is a question from someone asking about Mr. Nichols, and very many, like the other people, feel compelled to flee, to run for self-protection. If Mr. Nichols was still with us, would we have seen him prosecuted? And what would that have meant for his prosecution and a case against the officers who may have inflicted pain short of death? And this is a real scenario because it happens all the time. Any thoughts about that?
Would a court credit the legitimate fear of police in evaluating a charge of fleeing or resisting? That's a
great way to summarize it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I think the answer is no. I would be very surprised. I mean, I'm kind of at a loss other than to say I just don't see that happening.
Well, and there's also a Supreme Court case, I think Scott v. Harris, where the court said, I mean, this involved like the use of force was stopping, was using a pit maneuver, and the car, the person who's fleeing, their car flipped over and they became a quadriplegic. And the court basically said that was in this narrow circumstance, a reasonable way to use force. And this person, again, they were fleeing in a car, but but I agree with you, Lola. No, I don't think that we see that.
Thank you. Well, look, we are running out of time. I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds, which is not much time, to share anything that you want to underscore that's been said or anything that hasn't been said about the way forward. There's not just one path, but there may be multiple paths, but 30 seconds from each of you about a way forward. I'm going to start with Jonathan.
Thank you, Damon. Thank you, everybody. This has been a really rich conversation. So, it is, I think, very easy to having, every decade, one of the, something like this happen. And then, really the movement since the death of Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, et cetera, to feel real despair about what's happened. But I also, recognize, I think it's important for us to recognize that there is a stronger and growing political movement to bring about fundamental change. And so it is far too slow. But what we saw in the summer of 2020 was one of the most uplifting things that you could imagine. And I hold on to the hope that was, even though the window closed, that the uprisings in the summer of 2020 will carry us through.
So much. Arthur.
Thank you, Damon. And echoing Jonathan's thanks for to everybody on this panel and to all the audience members and the questions. It involved individual and collective involvement at all levels. It really shouldn't be on the citizens of the country to, on a daily basis, try to affect change in policing. But we're sort of at an emergency port right now, and that's what we have to do. Where I live, which is just outside of the District of Columbia, there's discussion about rising crime rates and how we need more money for cops. And this is on my neighborhood listserv, right? And so I don't want to come home in the evening and have to do that on my free time. But there's a responsibility to engage and say, look, this is a problematic discussion. And so there are things that people can do on a daily basis to try to recognize and address the problem. And for those who don't live in and or engage with Black voices and Black communities, believe Black people. This is what the experience is like with the police.
Thank you. Cammie.
Yes, I just think we need, I agree with everything that's been said. And I want to thank the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights for having these discussions and for taking a stand on these issues. And I just think we obviously need a paradigmatic shift in how we think about policing. And until that happens, until we're ready to have big and bold movements of taking officers out of traffic stops and reforms like that, I don't think that we're going to continue moving. And I just don't want all of these victims, and we have to continue to say the names of these victims and remember their life. And also, unfortunately, that they are reminders that we are not where we want to be in our society with respect to the sanctity of human life. That's what's missing in policing, is the sanctity of human life.
That's right. Lola.
I think that I'm encouraged, as we alluded to earlier, about how quickly the prosecutor responded in this instance. And I hope that it reflects sort of an acknowledgement of what communities of color are entitled to expect when their loved ones are murdered by police. I think that's part of what we tried to do with the Chauvin prosecution, is to kind of show the level of diligence that people of color are entitled to when they are victims seeking to have their rights vindicated by the justice system. And so I think part of the path forward is continuing to ensure that people of color receive the full benefits of the justice system when their rights are infringed upon. I think that the activist community plays a huge role in that. I mean, that's how we saw the prosecution assigned to Keith Ellison. That's how we've seen in some jurisdiction charges get modified. I'm sure that's part of why we saw charges come forward so quickly. It sets a different expectation. And I think that also could potentially also inform the way that juries are willing to see and apply the facts to the law when they are called to serve. The other part that I do want to just highlight, and I wish we had more time to talk about, is the role of police unions. You can do a lot of training, but you cannot train humanity. And if we continue to have unions that support acts of inhumanity and breed cultures that lack humanity, then we will continue to have these problems. We have to have a serious conversation about the role that police unions play in the way that communities of color experience police.
Thanks so much, Lola, and to all of our panelists, Cammie, Arthur, Jonathan, Lola. Thank you so much. Look, I want to close just by framing the lawyers community's work. I won't give you the details. We don't have time for that, but I want to frame how we think about these issues in this work and what we're pushing for with Arthur and his team and across our policy unit and throughout the organization. First, we are trying to change the narrative to stop people from talking about bad apples and rogue cops and look at the entire system. You can't do well if you don't understand the assignment. The assignment is looking at the whole system. Second is, to Lola's point, mapping the power. What creates the inertia? It is fear, sometimes of crime, but just fear, lack of creative alternatives, and power structures like police unions that have a vested interest in protecting every officer pretty much no matter what. Third thing, follow the money. That's the federal money. That's also the state money and our taxpayer dollars, and claw that money back if we have to make sure it is put to righteous and good use. And then finally, change the law. There cannot be any accountability without liability. That's what you all have done in your working careers and what you continue to do. I thank you for your efforts in being in partnership with us at the Lawyers Committee and the broader civil rights and racial justice movement. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. Stay connected to us, be part of this conversation, be part of the activism. We need you. Take care.
Thank you.